brings us to apologies. As you can see, our Mayor is not well and he is an apology. We also have, hopefully at some point again, Councillor Vandervis rejoining the meeting by phone, but it looks like there's been some technology glitches. So I'll move that the apology be sustained. Seconded Councillor Wilson. All in favour? Against? Carried. Confirmation of the agenda. I move that the agenda be confirmed as it is. Seconded Councillor Newell. All in favour? Against? Carried. Oh, and I also have to move that in regard to standing C be adopted, moving and seconding and speaking to amendments. So seconded by Councillor Wilson. No discussion. I'll put it all in favour. Against? Carried. Declarations of interest. Just want to remind members of the need to stand aside from decision making when they identify a conflict of interest. And I will move. Or firstly, is there any councillors who wish to amend their conflicts of interest? Councillor Hawkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like it recorded that I'm now a shareholder in a company called Thank You Payroll. And while I'm on my feet, I'd also like it registered in the councillor's interest, my membership of the Green Party of Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Councillor Hawkins, we will note those. No other amendments? Moved by Councillor Wilson, seconded by Councillor Hall. All in favour? Against? Carried. I'll move that the Council confirms the public part of the minutes of the Ordinary Council meeting held on 27 June 2017 as a correct record. Seconded Councillor Newell. All in favour? Against? Carried. Community Board minutes. Councillor Lord.
Okay, thank you. Hey, I'd just like to move the minutes of the Community Boards, items 7 to 10 and also item 12. I've withdrawn the Waikowhati Community Coast Board meetings because there's going to be some minor editorial change, so I've moved 7 to 10 and 12.
Seconded Councillor Wiley. Any discussion? If not, I'll put it. All in favour? Against? Carried. That brings us to the first of our reports, the 2017 Dunedin City Flood Event Update.
Sorry.
So we're ahead of time by 2 minutes.
Isn't the item 11 have to be dealt with? Item 11 wasn't moved.
Pardon?
Item 11 for the Community Board for Waikowhati Coast wasn't moved. I think there's a minor amendment. Is that right? Oh, withdrawn.
Was withdrawn.
Oh, sorry.
Yes. So are we going to wait for 2 minutes?
Perhaps you could start, Sandra.
We've obviously been too efficient.
Which is the on? Oh, there we are.
Well,
Apologies, councillors. So we thought it was an opportunity today to provide an update on the flood event that happened Friday a week ago and the city's response to that. And so I can speak to the recovery. The Chief can also speak to some of the response dealt with, and Tom is here to speak on behalf of the infrastructure teams. So, do you want to?
Out, so just hold your face kind of even distance.
Okay, is that working?
Yep.
It's not very often that you can't hear me clearly. Do you want to kick off, Chief?
So we had been given notification that a heavy storm may well hit the city. So in the days preceding, not quite as well as if we'd had a rain radar, but approaching that, we were sending out messages to people to, in the same way as we did for the April flood that didn't arrive, or the April deluge that didn't arrive, for people to clean out their own gutter, clean the surface of the mud tanks. We had in town, the mud tanks, as you all know, are now on a very we clean the screen every time there's an imminent flood, so or an imminent downfall. So all of that was well underway. But the surfaces, when heavy rain causes runoff, the tops of the grills gets blocked very quickly, and that can mean that water cascades over and on down the road. So we did remind people to clean their own and not just blow or people scooping it to the side of the gutter and it just covers over again, but to put it in a and take it onto their own section. They can tip it back on the road later if they want, but just to take it out of the way. And so a very good response to that. The morning of the expected downfall, we put the Parks Department, G&D's team, put sand out in locations, and I was surprised with how many sandbags they managed to track down. After being confident we had about 2,000, at the end G&D informed us that we'd actually put out 5,000 sandbags been made available to people, and 8,000 sandbags been made about by the end of the event. We had teams of people helping to fill sandbags, so some people are able to fill their own. We rushed out and bought shovels so that people were filling sandbags. So all of that, the community response is just a different beast than it was 2 years ago, frankly, the lessons learned. So Sandy was controller during the Friday as we got ready for the event, and then I was the controller over the Friday night, which was when the entire downfall did rather feel like a civil defence exercise. In an exercise you're doing something and it all seems fairly logical, and then they throw a thing at you and you sit at the desk and think, oh, seriously, that would never happen. Actually, Friday night did feel like that. We heard that one of the gates on the flood bank hadn't closed properly. We weren't sure whether there was water had gone underneath it and was about to collapse the flood bank, or whether the gates just hadn't shut properly, which is what it was. But it was underwater, so you couldn't see, which meant that we had to think about evacuating Outram. The roads in and out of Outram were almost impossible. 2 unimogs had been sent up to deal with for the army to deal with a medical emergency in Oamaru. Which means we were starting to work out how quick would we be able to evacuate 400 houses in Outram if the bank did actually fail. How many Unimog trips would that take? How long would it take to get Unimogs back here? And the army were fantastic in helping with that. We just got lower Outram, 100 houses evacuated. We opened a welfare centre. The men from the local supermarket kindly put on food for people and things. Most people went to their neighbours, people on the high side of Outram, if there is such a thing. And then we just got those 100 evacuated, and we heard through the grapevine somebody rang to say they'd just seen an enormous orange arc in the sky, and the substation had gone underwater, and they thought it had blown up, and all of Henley was now in the dark, and what were we going to do about that? So now you had 100 people staying at other people's houses in the pitch black darkness at 2 o'clock in the morning, and the whole event did feel like a series of these. It was good. There is no doubt that our staff are better trained than they were a couple of years ago. So the training through the regional council's been pretty relentless, and people just swung in to do what they had to do. And I'd have to say the event itself was handled well with all parties. We had the regional council set up their group EOC because there was also a state of emergency declared for Waitaki and for Clutha, and so a state of emergency for coastal Otago because it went across the boundaries of more than one council. So they were running in our bunker and in one room, and we were running in the bunker in the big room. So the exchange of information was very positive. Over their data, you could just next door and try and get it sorted rather than people getting fractious on the phone. So I'd have to say, from a staffing perspective, the event was held very well. Was managed well and unfolded. It's difficult. I mean, the idea of evacuating almost 200 or over 150 houses in that upper ponding area and the lower ponding area and the spillway. And there's some challenges that we need to think about going into the future about those. I mean, that whole system did function the way it should, and in most parts, the predominance of parts that got flooded were areas that were designed to be flooded and to take water overflow. But there's some areas of low-lying coastal housing that we need to have some thinking about. There's some impact of ongoing development on the Taieri, which is certainly stretching some of our infrastructure, and we'll be having some pretty close discussions about individual pockets of those, and we'll be coming back to you about what our thoughts are about those.
So I'll get Tom is here to speak on behalf of the infrastructure teams because the bulk of our response activities fell to them, and they did a fab job.
Right, so following up on Sue's bits and pieces, generally the infrastructure teams found it, we had plenty of time to prepare, plenty of time to engage contractors, ensure they were all ready to go, and it's the core. Close to Sandy.
I'm good with that.
Get everything underway. So staff were in and out of meetings about the event later on Thursday afternoon. Screens, mud tanks. Assessed in South Dunedin, and the compliance rate was 94% or something like that, which is pretty substantial. Those same mud tanks were assessed after the event as well with a good compliance rate. So same thing with the screens. They were all nice and clear prior to the event, and we did go into it feeling that there was there's an element of positivity about how the systems were set up to deal with it. We spent a lot of time cleaning up capital works sites, shutting them down, and preparing them for what was to come. The forecast it was quite important that the forecast looked nice and even across the city. It looked like we were going to receive a substantial amount of rain across the city. It became very clear early on Friday night that was not necessarily how it was manifesting. We saw substantial rainfall in the Swampy Summit, Taieri, Mosgiel Taieri, and then up into Strath area. So I think, for example, just over 260 mil fell at Swampy Summit, whereas 91 mil fell at Musselburgh. That was quite important in terms of having that intelligence throughout the event. That mixed with some of the good comms we were getting from the customer services teams and the nice clear line of communication from our contractors on the ground meant that we were able to focus that resource in Mosgiel and in and around the urban areas that were being significantly affected throughout the event. It was, as Sue said before, it was far easier to coordinate, and we had far more intelligence to be able to try and manage the event than we ever have before. So as we got into the event, there was a whole lot of actions going on. Sandbags were being supplied by the parks team. We'd procured pumps from outside of the city, as far away as Invercargill, to where we could, where there was the option to deploy during the event to try and avoid water levels rising to a level where they were impacting houses. We did have one area that was really successful for, and was significant. pump and avoid flooding of those particular properties, which was quite different, and different that we're able to do that and prepared to do that. So since the event, during the event we had a number of customer calls and that sort of thing, and we tried to focus all of our resource where it would be most effective in terms of collective good. But moving into the day after and Saturday, it became up and managing volumes of work and ensuring that we were prioritising the work in a way that meant that those most affected were dealt with first, or the areas where we could have the most benefit were dealt with. 200 jobs, wastewater cleanups, all of that sort of thing. So they were largely carried out by Tuesday this week. There are 5 calls that are outstanding at this stage, and they're more complex and more challenging. But of those 200, there's only 5 still outstanding, which is a really good result. In the transport space, they've managed to get around the city and do full assessments. There's over 310 sites looked at. Just checking on the numbers, I've just picked this all up today. So over 310 sites assessed, anything from slips to minor road damage and scouring. So of those 310 sites, over 83 have now been fully. The others still require some geotechnical assessment and that type of work. The professional resource that we've pulled from across the city has been really willing and in terms of activating them and getting geotechnical resource, structural resource, all of that sort of thing, all of those types of consultants on board, they've been really positive and really responsive to our needs so far. Bridge assessments and that sort of thing, the preliminary bridge assessment work and all of those sorts of transport works were carried out very quickly. Now we're moving into a bit of a detailed phase, so having structural engineers on site for 4 or 5 hours, overview of the that work will all be completed by the end of the week, which at this stage is all looking quite positive. There were two bridges lost during the event, made fully. Mount Ross and at least, yeah. They're both bridges, both heritage. The community boards and NZHPT on how we manage those sites. There was a substantial volume of road closure. Largely now we've got most of those open. I think there's a further 12 that are likely to be open today, and we should end up very. The 4 road closures that have been in place for a long period of time and were closed before the event by the end of the week. Minor that are being worked on. It requires the same resource that's first, and then we'll start working in the recreation space in a bit bigger.
Questions, councillors?
If I could just maybe very quickly the recovery effort, and so that was all part of response and moving. Was the welfare aspect of our people. It's been a really important thing, and it was interesting this morning. We had a bit of a handover in the bunker. It was observed that that's the longest time we've kept the bunker operational, and so while we scaled back our infrastructure operation to the Civic Centre, we kept the civil defence bunker open to deal with welfare issues up until today. and that's been really marvellous. And so we've had a cross-agency group meeting there every day, and then folk from various departments stationed in the bunker to enable that really good communication, clear decision-making, and our ability to deal with the issues of our residents almost immediately. And so we've responded to things from help with wet carpet to people who didn't have electricity but just needed some firewood so they could dry their house out. So look, we came up with practical solutions to give effect to whatever helped our community be resilient. The call centre is now having relatively few calls come through. We attempted to contact all of the people that had been flooded. Some people we didn't find at home, but we did a leaflet drop to all of those houses as best we could once we were able to and it was safe. We worked closely with Red Cross around that, and we utilised our community networks as well with the various community boards in the area. We're still, yesterday we got calls from people in Waikaoiti that we hadn't heard housing, and they'd been managing just fine, but then all of a sudden they weren't. And so we're responding to those as immediately as we can. There were 500 or so people, calls on individual properties that had some issue or other, and we have now made contact with virtually all of those and helped them work through a solution to best meet their needs. And the needs are really varied. It just depends on the situation they've found themselves in. Our public information team they've done a great job along with everyone else, but I think that's been one of the real lessons, is that we've engaged and communicated on any number of channels with our community. Had really positive feedback about that, and that involved our communication with you, with the and letting them see how we did things. That worked really well. Scale things back a little bit in terms of operating out of the bunker now. All of the agencies we've put in place ways of contacting each other, which means we can keep on dealing with things immediately, but we don't need to have that resource in the bunker. So that's where we're at.
Councillor Newell.
Just one for the Chief. Thank you very much. Just one for the Chief. Regarding the rain radar, where are we with that? When can we get one? I just thinking with the ongoing changes that we're experiencing, and more monitoring stations as well, possibly for South Dunedin and the harbour.
I'll defer to your councillor colleague who has been pushing this issue for some time.
David Loffrey wrote a really good piece in the...
It's quite good, isn't he?
Yeah, and apparently a site has now been chosen and it's going to be in 1819, but that is a question I was going to ask, because given that we do not have coverage, in fact it snows in our place and you can't see it on the weather radar at all, on the and the Met Service, my question about that was, would it have made a difference if we had a better idea, realising that the weather data is only one part of it, but it's building the picture for predicting the weather in the future, whether we should be asking, now that they've got a site, whether we should be able to get that sooner?
In this case, the predictions we got were really good and really useful. And as I understand it, the site that they're looking at should help us look across the whole city. You know, so we'll...
Yeah. So, but at the moment they're not intending to do it to 1819, and my gut feeling is that the sooner we get it, the sooner the data can be collected to give us a much better surety. I mean, yes, it was good this time, but will it be good next time? And I'm just wondering if it would make a difference. Otherwise, I have got a motion to that effect, but I'm happy to withdraw it if it's not necessary.
Different events, occur in different ways, and I think in this particular event we were reasonably well served by the forecasting and the data we had available to us, and it is true that with the rain radar in the future we would be able to potentially act in different ways or consume that information in different ways and make better decisions, but at this stage I don't necessarily see that as being critical to our overall response effort. The amount of information you have coming in and going out, you need to act on a number of sources, both customer calls and that sort of thing. So it would just be another string to the bow, if you like.
Sorry, just to labour the point. So do we have a date? Are we getting one? And do we have a date? For example, most of the water fell out toward the Taieri. If we'd had the big pay dirt on South Dunedin again, it could have been a very, very different situation. If we'd had the same amount of rainfall that fell at Silver Peaks, for example, in South Dunedin, it could have been very, very different. And the rain radar gives you that specific time and place.
Yeah, so I guess a couple of things to your question there. The first one would be, yes, I believe that there is work occurring to install a rain radar at the present point. I think
They're in negotiations.
Yeah.
They're in negotiations for a site, and at the moment it's commercially sensitive, but we understand it will be a site that meets our needs adequately.
Councillor Benson-Pope.
Effort, but I think it would be more appropriate if that was something you dealt with, Mr Chairman, in due course. But I do have a question that's partly following on from my colleague on the left, and that's in terms of the volume that fell in the urban area, or predominantly in the south, because it's already been speculated, of course, that the enhanced cleaning regime, etc., solved the problem, and if it had rained heavily, it would all have been all right this time anyway, unlike, or would have been last time had that been the case, if you get my drift. And I do recall the Chief Executive making some comments about that rainfall issue, or the lack of it out south, thank goodness, and I think it would be good to put that on the public record and confirm that, please.
so it would be fair to note that this was a completely different event in South Dunedin to the one in 2015. Well, yes, we had rain over a long period of time, and yes, there was a fair bit of it, but the intensities and the level of rainfall that we saw were completely different. I think we were talking about a max intensity of 7 or 8 mils at Musselburgh over 1 or 2 hours, whereas in the June 2015 event, we were looking at up to 15 mils an hour, and over a period, and a really intense period over 6 or so hours, which makes a huge difference to the way our stormwater catchment responds. So no, I think we'd be, if it was June 2015 again, we would be, if it was the same rainfall, we wouldn't be in the same position we are today.
Councillor Wilson, did you still have a question, or did you been dealt with? Okay, Councillor Gary.
I'm curious to know if your sense of community response is the same as mine. My sense was that through this event that the community had learned, not only had council learnt various things, but the community had also learnt, and my sense was that as a community we were better at self-help and preparedness and kind of knowing what to do because of the experiences of 2015. Was that your sense as well?
Most certainly it was, and I think that the community has developed a degree of resilience that we may not have realised existed before, and we've worked out a way as the civil defence machinery to tapping into that, and partly that's our new structure where we have a staff dedicated to working with the community to help them build their own resilience, and I think the testament to that was the work in Mosgiel, in Saddle Hill and Waikoiti, and on the peninsula.
Thank you. And the other thing that I wanted to say, and it really taps into what Councillor Benson-Pope was talking about, and perhaps there'll be a more formal resolution, but I just wondered if it had been passed on, or to ask that it be passed on to both staff who worked so hard and to contractors, because I'm very aware that there were contractors out there in the middle of the night in what was actually quite frightening situations in many cases, with slips coming down around them, and they're out in the middle of the night in the dark, keeping our community safe. And that has been hugely appreciated by the community, and it would be very important to me that that be passed on to the contractors involved.
Yeah, some of that has been passed on, and we'll continue to do that. I also would like to point out that, of course, we had the cyclone event in April, And really that was the first time that we practiced doing this a different way. Now that one turned out to be a practice, but the putting of sand and the making available of sandbags and things, it worked incredibly well then and then wasn't needed, but in some ways it was an entire community, council, contractor, civil defence practice run. There is no doubt that having more of these makes us better at them. Up until 2015, it's been a long time since there was anything that really needed this kind of response, and we've had, well, between that and the tsunami, where we also had some evacuations and we declared, this is the third one in a relatively short space of time, and so people know their roles, know their jobs, know each other, know what didn't work last time and how to fix it.
Councillor O'Malley.
Thanks. I just wanted to say, the response actually was quite fantastic, and as each of the community boards did their little bits of roles, I was watching from afar from the Waikowhati coast. I just noticed one thing actually, it was sharing of information, and it was there was a road closure at Karatani, and I went on to the NZTA site, and the Waikowhati road closure was on it, but not the Karatani one. And the chair thought that was because that was an NZTA site and not a DCC site. So I'm just wondering, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of post-event stuff, checking things, all I's and dots and all that stuff. So this is not by any means a criticism, it's just something I noticed in the middle of the event, making sure that we're sharing our databases.
What I would say is we've had our post-event response debrief, and that was one of the exact points that came up, and whether in terms of how we manage the bunker, we might need NZTA there with us. They're not normally in our bunker. And while we are really heartened by the response this time, there will be lessons that we've learned as well. And our aim is always to do better next time. And so we certainly had taken on board a number of things that we think we could do better.
Councillor Wiley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have one comment to make, is knowing how the community boards really work this time around. You've just touched on it a little bit, but I know how tirelessly Paul Pope worked out in the Peninsula and the other community board chairs and their committees. So I just would like to see that acknowledged. And did you find that system that they were a lot more engaged this time?
We had good networks in all of our communities, and so those with community boards, we have a structure that we're able to utilise reasonably easily, but in areas without them, we also have started to develop really good networks in those areas as well. So I think a point that was raised earlier, the level of community resilience that we're building across the city in areas with community boards or without is so much better than it was 2 years ago.
Do we see much issues with ongoing road slips? I know out on the peninsula there's a few issues. Are we seeing, you talked about something like 300 odd works, or how many of those would you consider more than being fixed in a couple of weeks?
So like those 300 sites before, that was road scouring and a number of other issues as well. But so in terms of slips, there were about 30 that were substantial, most of which have been cleared now. There will be an element of some of those sites still being geotechnically active. We're still receiving a bit of rainfall. We are still in winter, so once we get a heavy, substantial amount of rainfall, we can expect those areas to remain sodden for a period of time. We're monitoring those sites. We've, as I mentioned before, we've engaged a huge amount of geotechnical expertise and resource through the consulting community to actively try and deal with some of that stuff. But at this stage, I'm not aware of any specific sites that we're really concerned about.
I understand the Lawyer's Head pipe was used to release water, and how did that work, and has there been any effect on the beaches?
Yes, so Lawyer's Head was opened on Friday night, as were a number of other points that we used to alleviate pressure in the wastewater system. There has been an impact on the local coastal environment. We did some testing straight after the event, which showed elevated levels of enterococci and E. coli, which which means that they both were above, so Enterococci was above the Ministry of Health guidelines for collection of shellfish, and E. coli was above the level for bathing for a period of time. Our second round of testing has occurred, and we're waiting for results today. But we'd expect them to be substantially better after a period of time.
Is that just the runoff from the streets and the infrastructure, or did it go through the excess flow through the Tahuna wastewater?
It's a combination of all of those things. So the testing and the results that we've seen on the open ocean side of the peninsula and the city beaches would largely be related to the Green Island and Tahuna wastewater outfalls and Loy's Head outfall. And some minor stormwater outfalls as well, and some of the contamination in the harbour is rather related to localised network issues and some of the stormwater drainage as well.
And through the chair, just wanting to find out about the farmers, and I see Councillor Lord is already starring on the ODT this morning, and what the impact has been on the farmers out on the Taieri.
Well, it's been significant, clearly. As part of our welfare recovery, we've worked closely with the various organisations that are set up to work with the farming groups. And at our regular welfare meetings, we had a representative from Federated Farmers and the Rural Trust folk. And their view is it's about farming strong. And so we did what we could to help that, aware, of course, that some folk are still underwater and some of those challenges are about to hit them. But wherever we could, we have gone out and we've provided skips and help with immediate rubbish. But some of the challenges for the farmers aren't 5-minute fixes. There's some serious infrastructure and rubbish issues, aside from the fact of all of the animal welfare things, which are really front and foremost for the farmers.
Councillor van der Vest, did you have a question?
No, I'm quite happy. Thank you very much for the opportunity, though, Chris.
Very good. Councillor Newell.
Yeah, apologies. First and foremost, I just wanted to thank the staff, contractors and volunteers because that was my initial point. The rain radar sort of snowballed. But yeah, from a communication point of view and from the media, I get both sides of it. Obviously, what's coming through from the bunker and what's coming through from the public as well, and they don't tend to hold back. And without exception, we just had positive responses, and it was a really great community response to the council. And I think, you know, the headline in the ODT was testament to that, rare and beautiful as it was. Thank you very much, David. So, yeah, thank you very much to the staff. I just think it's been a wonderful, wonderful event on that side of the thing. Obviously, we're still mopping up for my friend here. No truth to the rumour, he's voting Greens now.
Councillor Lord.
Yeah, look, I just wanted to know, has the rural roads been reasonably well assessed already? Because I just noticed even on my place I've got probably 20 metres of Saddle Hill in a fairly large jigsaw puzzle, and obviously it's going to probably need to be reinstated along the side of the road. I don't know whether you can recover it from my place and use it again, or whether you bring new stuff and I recover that to fix up my tanker track. But I'm just wondering, do you know the full extent of the damage on some of the rural roads yet?
So the first assessments have been carried out, and so first assessments based on ensuring one lane's open across the city. Second assessments based on ensuring 2 lanes where possible are open across the city. So that's all occurred. That was our first critical task. Post that we've had 7 crews from Downers traversing the city, looking for exactly those types of work that need to occur. So that and I believe those inspections will be completed by the end of the week. That means the bulk of the network has already been assessed. So the 310 sites that I talked about before, that has been building over time, and will likely continue till the end of the week. But our understanding is developing and is but it's certainly getting pretty close. And where we do have an understanding of certain areas, we've already started engaging that detailed resource or getting the contractors on site to start cleaning up and start making good any defects.
Councillor Hall.
Yeah, the ORC have just put 5 more pumps in, which they got from the West Coast and Canterbury yesterday and today for pumping floodwater out of the Taieri.
Councillor Elder.
Hi, I was at Veggie Boys the other day and Marty from Veggie Boys ran after me and he said, thank you, thank you, thank you, and to say thank you to the City Council for the great work that they've done. A question I'd like to ask, just around the understanding of the rain event, are we going to do a thorough analysis of all the hydrology, you know, when the rain fell, etc., and little maps and things, so that people can have a good understanding of that?
Yeah, so we always do a thorough analysis of any reasonably significant rainfall event, which is usually just an internal exercise. But I think in this case we will look at putting something together for the public.
Yes, I just think that helps the public understand what happened, I suppose, and maybe that would help people understand the difference between what happened last time, what happened this time. What was the other question? Oh, the other question was, I live just below Singery Richmond, below the town belt, and the town belt has lots of trees with lots of leaves, and I think sometimes people think that maybe the DCC controls those leaves on the hills, but in fact can we do a clearer communication about those leaves will come down in a rain event and that it's okay for us to clear the drains and how we might do that? Because I know I cleared the ones in my area because, I mean, they just pour down the hills.
Oh, we did do that. So we did go out in advance and tell people to clear leaves off the gutters, keep an eye on them mud tanks and keep the leaves clear off the top. And actually a lot of the feedback that we've had has been that communication was particularly valuable.
Oh, good.
So we'll plan to do that every time.
Oh, thank you.
Councillor Wilson, I understand you had a resolution in mind.
I understand that you might be wanting to wish to move it, and that's absolutely fine.
Maybe we'll get it put up. So
Well, B can go because I'm not quite sure that, I don't think the staff thought that was necessary. So, I mean, I was going to move B, which was that where the radar be sped up.
Today is the first.
So I assume you're happy, if you're asking me to move, you're happy to second.
Oh, it's the council. It did, no, oh, yeah.
That's it. That is the resolution. So, Councillor Wilson, are you happy to second?
Yes.
I am to move.
Fabulous effort.
Very good. We have a mover and a seconder. Any discussion? Councillor Steedman.
Can you read it out for Councillor Vandervis?
Who, me?
Thank you.
Can you read? That the council acknowledge with thanks the work of staff, ORC, contractors, emergency services and community volunteers for a job well done in working through the July 2017 flood event and recovery phases. Full stop.
Any discussion? If not, I'll put it. All in favour?
Aye.
Against? Carried. All right. We're moving on to the economic effects of proposed hospital redevelopment. Welcome Fraser Liggett and John Christie.
Good afternoon, councillors. The following report is in response to a request from Council to the CE on the 30th of May to prepare an economic impact assessment on the proposed hospital redevelopment. So, Infometrics was subsequently appointed to undertake this piece of work for us. And the report that you've got is basically broken into two parts. The first part is a quantitative analysis of the economic impacts of the redevelopment. So this suggests that the redevelopment could result in an additional $21 million annual boost to the Dunedin economy, regardless of the location, through the creation of jobs, predominantly in the construction sector. The second part is more of a qualitative analysis, and it's using multi-criteria analysis. And that's to identify the strengths and weaknesses of a number of options that are currently being considered by the Crown as part of a business case. So 5 potential redevelopment site locations and options are being considered, and the report looks at those in terms of basically economic activity within the central business district, linkages with the university, proximity for people and transport, scope, construction costs and procurement. Look, the report is attached for your information, and at this point, perhaps we can hand over for questions. John and I are happy to take questions at this point.
Questions, councillors? Councillor Benson-Pope.
Councillor Vandervis would like to ask a question.
Yep, got you. Councillor Benson-Pope.
Thank you, Mr Liggett. I was concerned, as I assume you might have been, to read what I read in the AGT this morning in terms of the front page article, which I guess at best suggested a lack of objectivity around the report, or at worst that it was actually biased. So I'd like to tease out the process you used, please, in terms of the framing of the terms of reference. I'm sure you don't like being accused of being incompetent or biased. And also the way the consultants, I understand there was more than one, were chosen, whether or not any elected members played any role in the framing of that terms of reference, or the decision about who got the job, and how the report subsequently arrived on your desks and was moderated in any way.
I'll just talk you through the procurement process that we went through and how we selected the preferred contractor. I prepared, or in conjunction with 3 Enterprise Dunedin, the scope for services for this piece of work. Again, it was setting out some key critical success factors, which are basically in relation to understanding the potential redevelopment options around the central business district, again, links with the university and so on. These are in effect informed by the discussions that happened on the 30th of May within the scope of the resolution. In terms of identifying the preferred contractor, we went through a procurement process where we tested the market with a number of firms. It was within council procurement policy through that process, and it was an internal selection panel that went through and chose the appointed contractor in itself. Which was Infometrics. The report we received probably a couple of weeks ago. Infometrics are a good, credible firm. They've been working through this piece of work. I've had pretty moderate sort of level of engagement with them myself in terms of beyond the development of the scope. It was a contract for services, and that's the outcomes that we received.
I can also just answer that there was no elected official involvement at all in this process, and staff were remote from all the decision-making other than running the process. We were determined that we wanted an independent report, and that was what we set out to achieve.
So can I take from that then that you don't agree with the inference in the media report this morning that there was a lack of objectivity or a degree of bias or one-sidedness to the report and its findings?
No, we believe there's always a fair degree of subjectivity. The key things, as Mr Liggett's outlined, is that we wanted to know what the economic impact on the city was and where an independent A third party would assess the best location for that, and we believe we tasked them with that job and they came back with a result that you can discuss here at Council.
A couple more, if I may. So for the sake of clarity, and you referred to this in your initial comments, it would be a fair assumption that if we were comparing a hospital of specification X, whatever that might be in due course, no matter where that was built, it would have more or less the same effect on our gross domestic product.
That's correct.
Okay, and that was part of the study and it came up with what we would expect.
That is correct, and we understand there could be some variances around that depending on the final location, but they wouldn't be material in terms of the stage of the business case.
Perversely, a more expensive location such as the Central City one would be more complex, would it not, and therefore would probably be more expensive and perversely would generate more funding.
Potentially, yes.
Thank you. So that was part of the study. The second part was completely objective, or as objective as the person doing it could be, given the lack of information about lots of elements to this discussion, about the desirability or not of various sites, of which some have already been discounted by, including the Hillside site, have already been discounted by government because the current options are 3 only, 2 on Central City, close proximity to the existing, and Whakaari. Is that correct?
That's my understanding.
Okay. Can I ask you about Hillside, though, because for reasons that I'm sure are beloved to our remote tourist in France or Germany or wherever Councillor Van Vis is, the Hillside site has been touted and now discounted by the Southern Partnership, but it's my understanding there are still operations happening, industrial operations happening at Hillside. Is that not the case?
Yes, that is correct. Bradkins are operating a foundry there with approximately 50 jobs currently and potential for growth.
Would you describe Hillside, just for the record, as a relaxed park-like atmosphere?
That wouldn't be my assessment.
Thank you. And my final question at the moment then, can you confirm that, and that wasn't really clear from the report this morning, that the final preference considered and chosen by the consultants was for an inner city development more or less on the same site or the same site expanded, possibly with some deal with the university in terms of those synergies, and that was quite a clear preferred option as a result of the study?
That is correct.
Thank you.
Councillor Van Vis.
Number of questions. The first is, why were the 6 qualitative assessment criteria not including the ability of the hospital in the future to expand to double the number of 65 plus population that's anticipated? That is to say, why only 6 qualitative assessment criteria and why none of them address the need to future-proof our hospital for an ageing population?
My understanding is the firm that undertook this has looked at some future proofing in the work that they did, but that was probably out of scope for the amount of work that we required them to do.
Given that the hospital is going to have a 50-year life, why is the future needs of the hospital not part of the qualitative assessment?
The scope was included, but you must bear in mind, Councillor, that this was a desktop exercise to look at the economic impacts of the rebuild of the hospital for its needs as we can clearly identify at this present time.
Right. The second question then is why the 6 qualitative assessment criteria do not include the vast land purchase cost and the interfering with current operations costs of rebuilding on the current site plus additional land?
So just to be clear, the quantitative assessment, if you're looking at Table 9 in terms of the factors that were considered, they were set by the economist that undertook this work, not by us.
And the economist was whom then? And why did an economist set these assessments, basically stacking them, as I believe, in favour of a central CBD hospital?
Because we decided that if staff set them, we would be accused of stacking the criteria in favour of a CBD hospital. So we allowed the consultant to consider. He knew the areas that were being considered, and the wide brief was tell us what the preference is without us giving an indication, and for him to determine what were the key elements. But he did take land costs into account.
Land costs don't appear in any of the 6 criteria, and retaining economic base in the CBD
Point of clarity.
Appear.
Can we have a point of clarity?
Why is it that retaining economic base in the CBD is even a criteria at all?
There's a point of clarification. I'm not quite sure that. I'm not sure how long Councillor Vandervis has had his report, judging from something I saw in an email earlier today. But my understanding, and I'm wondering if the CEO could correct me, is that the last criteria was procurement, including land costs, and the second last one was construction costs, including difficulty of building in those sites. Is that correct?
Yes.
Which I think addresses the concerns that Councillor Vandervis just made. I'm hoping.
I'm afraid that my concerns over the way the 6 qualitative assessment criteria have been chosen, I don't believe accurately represent what the real needs for our future hospital are. And I would like to ask the question similarly posed by Councillor Benson Pope, and that is, what chance is there of a modern ideal hospital that could require as much as 10 hectares of land being built, producing a park-like setting? What chance is that of that happening in the CBD? Is there? Is there any chance at all?
I'm sorry, Councillor, we don't have that level of detailed information.
In the report, it says on page 106 that an ideal modern hospital could require as much as 10 hectares of land. You have answered Councillor Benson Pope, claiming that a park-like setting would not be available at the Hillside site. I am asking you, do you think it would be available in the CBD?
Councillor Benson Pope asked John Christie whether or not he considered that the South Dunedin site was currently a park-like setting, and he said no.
Right. In that case, does he consider that the CBD is currently a park-like setting?
In part, yes.
CBD is a park-like setting. I don't know who I'm talking with here.
Queen's Gardens would be case in point.
My question is, why is it that we have a higher number listing under qualitative assessment for an ideal modern hospital that the report itself admits cannot possibly be built in the CBD because there is only at most 3 hectares of land available, and a modern hospital could require as much as 10 hectares. Why are we already compromised in not having the ideal modern hospital?
The report indicates the preferred site is the current location with the additional land.
I'm very aware of what the report says. I'm asking, why does the report say this when there is no possibility for hospital expansion, looking at the doubling of the number of 65 plus year olds that we are anticipated to have? And why is it that there is no mention in the qualitative assessment of the impossibility of having this expansion or of having the park-like setting required for an ideal modern hospital?
Councillor van der Vis, this wasn't the brief that was given to the economists. The same was aimed at what is the economic benefit or otherwise of having a hospital located in our CBD. They have looked at the sites that it could be put on, and that is what is in that report. We didn't ask them whether we wished them to decide whether we should have a park-light setting or not.
No, that's absolutely true. I accept that, but I cannot accept that they refuse to look at the future-proofing of our hospital when the increase in the 65-plus population of 44,000 people points to a significant increase in healthcare demand, which they say in their own report cannot be accommodated with the available land in the CBD.
One of the criteria in the councillor and the quantitative assessments was the scope to expand.
Thank you. That's the end of my questions.
Councillor Hawkins.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just picking up on Councillor van der Vis's point, the 3-hectare figure from my reading of the report was referring to the capacity to build a site entirely on greenfields land in the central city, discounting the land already owned by the DHB on the current campus site. Is that also your understanding?
It's our understanding.
Thank you. And just seeking clarification, I understand this is an economic impact assessment, but the brief didn't ask the consultants to consider any planning constraints or potential natural hazards, be they groundwater or flooding related, or potential contamination as hail sites or otherwise, when that came to identifying their preferred options.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Councillor Wilson.
I'm interested in the methodology here, and maybe I've misread it, but there's an inherent problem with the 1, 2, 3 and the qualitative assessment, because what I don't, and maybe I'm misreading it, but if you get a 3, for example, for retains economic base in CBD, it doesn't mean that you're 3 times something that got a 1. And I found that quite awkward to understand. And, that's the first question.
Yeah, that's correct. It's a qualitative assessment, it's not a multiplier effect, and the report could probably have been more explicit in terms of that explanation within there.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm glad I've read it correctly. And on that same basis, it's interesting to me that they've taken these all as equal weighted factors rather than considering that while procurement may be a substantial cost at the upfront, that some of the benefits that come from, for example, to the university of having medical school staff that want to be training and a whole lot of other things that go with those synergies over a very long period of time, at least 50 years, as Councillor van der Vis noted, would have a much longer ramifications, and so could potentially have more weight. Am I reading that correctly?
You are. Each of the criteria has the same weighting within there, but you know, with further work through this, there might have been an adjustment around the particular weighting within there. But the report is each of the criteria has the same level of weighting.
Well, that's good, because it's interesting to me that the matters that the central city site is possibly less favourable for are relatively short-term factors, as compared to the other factors that I would personally, without any expertise, but would have weighted substantially different or higher than those as the front end costs, and potentially that would have ramifications of even putting this site, the CBD site, at a higher value. Is that something that you would have done yourselves, being better?
Look, within the report itself, it touches on a number of strengths associated with the current status quo site, and that's certainly been based in in offshore research as well as analysis that's been undertaken by Infometrics, and that's around the agglomeration of economic activity associated within a centre city location and certainly health sector activity. The acknowledged strengths, if you like, of a compact city in terms of both its accessibility for both patients and also staff within that sort of space, and also the relationships with the proximity back to the university, which is, in effect had some spin-offs already, for instance, like with Pacific Edge and other activity in there, so there's that connectivity in terms of the economic benefits that are in relation to it. But they're probably the key factors in terms of that side of it.
Councillor O'Malley.
Unmute that and get back to my questions because I was reading an ODT article. To follow up on Councillor Benson-Pope, the hillside site, although it is now rejected but has been brought up in the past, I think not only does it have foundries at it, but also I believe that a lot of people think that those buildings at the end, which are somewhat inactive, are actually, if I'm correct, Kiwi Rail's heavy lift facilities.
Yes, that is correct. That's my understanding, Councillor.
So again, knocking those buildings out would actually knock out a capacity for rail coming into the future. The other thing the report noted, and it was something that I would just want clarification on, is that modern hospitals, that the current inner city site may not reflect the ability to build a large hospital on that site. But if you look at the Superior report, which I have to confess I was mispronouncing as the SAPO report, the clinical models that are being advanced by the Ministry of Health now tend to encourage people to be discharged quickly from post-operative care back into secondary sites off in the distance. And in fact, the model that we're going forward with for the Ministry of Health is that hospitals will in fact be smaller, not bigger. Is that correct, generally speaking?
Look, I'm not an expert in that area.
Well, that's a rhetorical question. Maybe.
Yes, maybe.
And before I walk away from that particular site, though, there was something that was noted, and I think that it relates not so much to that site, but something that the city needs to take into account. And it highlighted that there's a parking issue within that area. And although it's not related to the report, I think that we need to start considering the fact that for that hospital to be properly served, we probably do need better parking in the area. And I just want to comment on, are you aware that the author of the opinion piece that was cited as needing a 10-hectare site is Councillor Vandervis? The actual site, when it says in the report, some people have suggested that a hospital may need the biggest 10 hectares, and it cites a citing, which is an ODT opinion piece, which is actually Councillor Vandervis's opinion piece. So no wonder I can see how he comes to that opinion, I guess.
I wasn't aware it came from him.
Councillor Elder.
I fully support the idea of the hospital being in the CBD due to the economic impact in the CBD, proximity to tertiary institutions and being a teaching hospital and accessibility to motels, hotels and visitors, etc. I do, however, note that the disadvantages there are around...
Elder, is this a question?
Yes, I'm coming to that. We're looking at pedestrianising and making the city cycle friendly, and one of the notes is the downside relates to parking, and that's an issue that I agree with Jim about, that's something that we need to address, and I was just wondering what the story was there.
Thanks. Look, probably to be frank, their level of analysis hasn't gone into that great level of that level of detail. It has not discussed the scope to expand the construction, difficulty, procurement, proximity to people and transport. So it touches at a particular level. This piece of work is at a particular depth, I suppose. Those sort of considerations, I'm sure, have been considered in the full business case that's been currently prepared as well.
I see that the university and the Polytech and even the museum will have issues around parking. Has there been consideration of a park and ride kind of situation, which the university's doing with the stadium presently?
That hasn't been part of this piece of work around just looking at the economic impact of the rebuild of a hospital.
Councillor Gary, did you? Councillor Wiley?
Looking through this report, is there really anything here that we didn't really know before?
It does clarify the economic impact on the city over that 7-year period and where those jobs are likely to be. Whether that's of any great surprise to anyone, I guess, will be dependent on your level of knowledge about those sectors. And I guess the selection of site is probably the bit that has the most interest, Councillor.
So the 154 jobs are construction related. So we're not really looking at more hospital jobs in that sense?
Not that we're aware of, and it wasn't included in the analysis at this level.
Okay.
It's also worth noting the caveat at the beginning, which is some of those factors were based on quite old publicly released information on the size of the hospital. I think the publicly released information was that the build would be about $300 million. There's some suggestion of change since then, but the Economist was only able to go what was in the public record.
Okay, because that was going to be my next question. Is I don't think there's anybody around the table that can expect the hospital to be built for 300,000. I think we're 300 million. Yeah, 300,000 would be good, but 300 million. So more like double that price. Yeah, I believe that too. I didn't see a lot of discussion here about the impact of the hospital with the medical school. I saw a brief snippet on it, but not a lot.
That was out of scope. We really only asked them to do the analysis to look at the economic impacts and where they believe the most viable sites for that would be.
Okay, then
well, apart from, the criteria that talks about retaining those university linkages was part of that, Councillor.
No. Then, whether this is to the Chief or to you, John, part of the discussion on page 107 was talking about land swaps, whether from the university. I want to get an understanding, if I can, about the ACC land, because I understand it was the ACC side is just over 3 hectares, and when we discussed it, had a X value, which is way less than what we've got in the papers here. So ACC still going through their work, or?
ACC are still in the period where they had the ability to be doing their duty, doing their investigation, so we wouldn't sell it to anybody else, but it had always been, these are 2 government departments, ACC and the Ministry of Health, and I would expect 2 government departments to have discussions about what was the most important use of the land, as has always been said to those 2 government departments right through our discussions.
And then through your CEO discussions, through the hospital and through the university, has any of that discussion taken place about how things could rotate around that area?
So before we agreed to giving the ACC the ability to have an exclusive period to look at the land, there was discussions with the ministry and we had been very clear at that point that there was discussions with ACC and with the Southern Health Partnerships Group, and we've always been clear that we expect those 2 partners, those 2 government departments, to have discussions about who needs what, yes.
So the ACC, the university and the health partnership were all part of that discussion?
Certainly, we had discussions with the university, and we had discussions with the ACC, and we had discussions with the Health Partnership.
Okay.
Other questions? Councillor Benson-Pope, you had indicated you wished to make a change to the resolutions.
Yes, Mr Chairman, I'd like to move the recommendation with the addition and add a few words, simply continuing the same sentence and say, so it would read that Council notes the economic effects on Dunedin on the proposed hospital redevelopment report prepared by Infometrics and confirm its current position. And I do that because I think it's useful that we have an independent confirmation of the position that Council took as a result of the notice of motion some months ago. Since that time, there's been some resistance doing anything about it, but thankfully most of the Council are strongly, even more so than previously, behind telling government what's acceptable to the city, and thank goodness that that's already borne some fruit, because the more distant and green or brownfields developments have largely been ruled out, and we're down to 3. And as anyone who's been, the majority of people around this table have been working in the community, talking to people about this, they would be in absolutely no doubt, even before the snow day, of what the general community thinks about the mindlessness of locating a hospital at the top of a hill on an area where the current hospital was tried before and has already failed. The simple fact of the matter is that there are 3,000 people or more employed in the health complex. It's across the road from the med school, and this issue remains about not only decent health care being provided to our community, which they are clearly not getting now, but it also focuses on the health of the city. The health of the city depends on us holding on to a 5% or thereabouts of our workforce in the central city area. The retailers know that. And also the absolutely unique, sorry, not unique, only one other New Zealand city, namely Wellington, has a cohesive, active, lively, contained, healthy shopping street. And our main George Street is not without its threats. We all know that. We're about to spend a large amount of money on urban design improvements to that area. We know that the Regional Council is progressing the bus hub a block away from the central city area. We know that it would be an absolute no-brainer to try and shift people from a more remote hospital, even on the Whakaari site, to the med school and so on. And we know that we have better clinicians than we might otherwise have because they work in both the university and the hospital. And I think it's time that everyone around this table started pulling their weight and actually getting behind the absolutely essential nature of the redevelopment of the hospital in the central city, somewhere close to the current site.
Councillor Hawkins, I assume you wish to second. Do you wish to speak now? In that case, Councillor Lord, I think you were next up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say in regard to Councillor Benson-Pope, I haven't had a chance to read the paper today, so I'm not sure exactly what the content of the article was, but I will say that I have no issue with the report as it's written, but what I said was it depends very much on the questions that's asked. Now, we are working on a figure there of a $300 million rebuild. $300 million was the figure that was done or put in originally to rebuild the clinical services building. Now, if that building's rebuilt at a cost of 300, or should it blow out to 350 or 400 million, that's what you'll get, and you'll get an economic report. If you go to a green grass site or another site, and I'm not proposing any site, I've got no issue, but wherever, if you go to another site and completely rebuild a hospital, we're probably talking north of $1 billion, probably closer to $1.3 billion. That would absolutely blow that report out of the water if that was happened, because the economic drivers of spending 1.2 or 1.3 billion are completely different. The assumption, for example, and another assumption would be, you know, the 3,000 people living in that area. The assumption, if you went to Whakaari, and I'm only saying I don't have an opinion where you put the thing, but if you went to Whakaari and built a hospital there, the idea that suddenly 3,000 nurses or 3,000 doctors would all just use the Whakaari fish and chip shop and the dairy there to buy their lunch, or the hairdresser to get their hair cut, is almost laughable. So you would have new businesses created in that area, or they would travel to this area. Now, I don't actually have a problem with where you build the hospital. What I do want, and what I've always wanted, is the very best hospital services for this city. And as I'd say, running around getting names on clipboards, for me, is not the best way to do that. I think in due time we will see an announcement from the government and they will tell us some good stuff. And I don't think it will be too long to wait. But what I do think is that the best of this city is what I have in mind, and I think that's what we should all have in mind. And how we get that, we need to have different opinions on how we do that.
Councillor Wilson.
I'm just wondering, I'm happy to move it separately as a subsequent motion, or whether the mover and seconder are happy to have an amendment to add a B in along the lines which actually addresses the matters that Councillor Lord has just raised, and that is reiterates that Council are willing to assist with any requests to help facilitate the rebuild in the CBD. And I know that we've opened the door and said that we want to participate in that. I'm happy. I'll send the words shortly, but the question is whether the mover is happy to take that on, and I'll send that on.
Happy? Seconder happy? So, Councillor Wilson, you'll
Send the words
get it
right
onto
now.
there. Okay. Councillor O'Malley.
Oh, no, sorry.
Nope. Councillor Gary.
The community absolutely understands the positives about having the hospital rebuilt in the centre of the city. You only have to have been campaigning a couple of times, and I've done more than that, as have my colleagues, to know that the workers at Whakaari Hospital we speak to, the nurses and doctors from Dunedin Public Hospital who come up to speak to us, and the community members who use the hospital are very clear about the benefit of having the hospital rebuilt in the centre of the city. This report by Infometrics will not come as a surprise, but will be a welcome confirmation, affirmation of that. And so I welcome the report and I support the motion.
Councillor Hawkins.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think our community can take great heart in this report. It tells us what we thought we knew, but with a greater evidential grounding. And I thank staff and Infometrics for providing us with the evidential weight to back up our opinion. It's always useful and convenient from a campaigning point of view to be proved correct. It confirms what we thought we knew, that the best outcome for this city is retaining and rebuilding our top-flight teaching hospital in the city centre. Of the three options that remain currently on the table for that redevelopment, the only two that are recommended by this report are also the only two that are supported by this council's position that we'll reaffirm here this afternoon, and that is the current site, or an expanded version of the current site. The second of these, in fact, scoring 15 out of a possible 18, the best possible outcome in terms of the economic impact on the city. People may have read reports in the paper this morning highlighting perceived shortcomings in the report, and it's not perfect. As I said, it doesn't consider planning constraints, it doesn't consider possible contamination of possible development sites, it doesn't consider the presence of operating foundries on possible sites for hospitals. It does consider Hillside as a potential site. It also considers the cost of land of any development, it considers the future expansion needs of the hospital, and it considers the impact on the university of various options, which does make me wonder whether we all had the same papers circulated in advance of this meeting, given the questions that have been asked. It is exactly what we asked for, a report on the economic impact of different options for redeveloping our hospital. I found it extraordinary at the time that the chair of our Finance Committee and the deputy chair of our Economic Development Committee didn't want to know what the best economic impact would be in terms of the redevelopment of major public infrastructure, and further, that colleagues would suggest that they support the development of a top-flight teaching hospital in the city centre, but that we shouldn't do anything to try and make that happen and to rally our community around trying to make that happen, especially considering some of these are, and Councillor Lord is among them, are the first to infer that people would let their party political affiliations interfere with making decisions in the best interests of our community, and it's hard to see his commentary around this issue as anything other than an unwillingness to criticise the National Party of which he is a member. Our job is to represent the best interests of our community at all times, regardless of whether that makes it awkward next time we're lining up for a selfie with the Prime Minister. So thank you again to staff and to the economists who've done this work for us, and I applaud the work. It's useful in supporting the campaign, and I look forward to reaffirming Council's position at this meeting today. Thank you.
Councillor Steadman.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually concur with Councillor Hawkins there. Our job is to represent our community. Ultimately, this is about our people's health and their well-being. Just one thing I haven't heard through this whole thing is on former emergency services, I had to quite often try and get around this city in the dead of the night, in the snow, in the ice, trying to get a patrol car to save people's lives. How are you, I'm just imagining getting an ambulance or getting to the hospital if it is stuck up on the top of a hill where you cannot get to save that person's life. It is in the centre of the city, it's easy to get to. So bigger picture, I would hate to try and get a loved one to a hospital on the hill where I cannot actually get them looked after. So I will obviously be supporting this motion. Thank you.
No other speakers. Maybe before I give Councillor Benson, Councillor Wiley.
I'd like to speak, please.
Thank you, Lee. I'll get to you.
There's been a number of interesting points made around the table today. The first thing I'm going to say is I'm going to ask for these to be taken separately because, to be honest, $16,000 for this report, based on what it was given us and told, I still struggle to see something there that I really didn't know before. I've always supported, and I think everybody around the table supports a new hospital and a greater investment in healthcare in Dunedin. And I think that's number one. To continue here discussion of party politics and things like that, you know what, go down that road if you want, but let's focus on getting the best hospital we can for this city and the best location possible for this city. Now, unfortunately, we don't have all the cards on this table to play. The government is the one making the investment, but when I hear Councillor Benson Pope talk about telling government, he wants to go and tell government what they should do. No, you engage with government. You talk with government. You discuss with government and you make it work with them. You don't go and tell somebody. We don't want people telling us what to do all the time. We engage with them. That's the problem with a lot of this is what's gone on. I haven't supported this program from the outset and I struggle with the point in doing a lot of what's been done. We need to work with government to get the best hospital and the best services. You know, when you read the paper, the tragedy is the real story of someone being delayed by surgery isn't a bigger story. We should have these people at the top of the list. And we shouldn't be talking about waiting 7 years, we should be talking about getting construction underway as quick as possible. One of the things that really frustrates me is we're going down this process after everything we heard about the ACC site, how we should really work with ACC and go with that site. A lot of the information we're hearing today, and we heard it the same thing, you could actually have taken an economic report based on ACC at that time and compared it to the hospital because it was no different. There were no figures here that I can see that were actually going to be new. 154 construction jobs. The university have got 300 new construction jobs underway at the moment. A 0.4% gain. Yes, you're going to get a 0.4% gain because that's what approximately 150 jobs is going to equal. Let's focus on getting the best healthcare structure in the city. The other parts that I miss, and I've talked about it before, it is also ensuring the hospital stays near or closely affiliated, aligned to the medical school. For every job a medical school creates not just one hospital job, but an extra 1.8 when you combine the two together. You also increase care and resources that improve the whole community. Let's stick to the bigger picture here. Let's stick to what the real issue is. How do we actually help the government, work with the government to get the best hospital we can as quick as we can? That's what's important, not worrying about party politics and economic effect on this or that. So I'm going to totally support B. I still struggle to support A, so I won't be doing that. Thank you.
Councillor Vandevers.
Thank you. This report has a great number of things which are out of scope. In particular, parking has not been considered. Losing the one-way street parks is bad enough. We are also in the process of losing Frederick Street and possibly Falil Street as well. My main problem with this particular report is that there is no qualitative mention of future-proofing. All of the councillors around the table are hopefully going to reach the age of 65 plus in the next few years when this hospital is built, and they're going to find that there are going to be twice as many 65 plus year olds needing these hospital services as there are now. But there will be no room for parking, there will be no room for future expansion of the hospital to take this doubling of 65-year-olds, which are the majority of hospital users, and there will be no possibility for getting a decent amount of land to create a modern type of hospital as opposed to the old-style high-rise hospital we have currently. The report, which Councillor Hawkins claims highlights the economic impacts in the city, it in fact does not highlight economic impacts in the city. It highlights economic impact in the CBD, and that is a prejudgment of the report which fails to recognise that the economic impact in the CBD, which is certainly significant if we build the hospital there, would be a similar economic impact if we built the hospital anywhere else in Dunedin. I have no particular desire for anywhere or any particular place for the hospital to be built, but I do not agree that the trying to get a modern hospital squeezed into an insufficient land area in the CBD is in the future interests of the city. I agree with Councillor Hawkins that this report is useful in supporting the current campaign, but I believe that that's all it's useful for. I don't believe it's useful for anticipating the future increasing needs for hospital care. I don't believe it is useful for addressing the out-of-scope parking issues. I don't believe it is useful in actually creating or the understanding of what is required for a modern type of hospital. And for these reasons, I wish to vote against both parts of the resolution, if in fact it is going to be in two parts.
Councillor O'Malley, I had you down as having already spoken.
No, I asked questions, but then I said I didn't want to speak.
Okay, so Yes, you reminded me, you did say that. Go ahead.
I just wanted to, point out that I do think that this report maybe didn't necessarily tell us anything we didn't already know, but sometimes the exercise of formalising your concepts into a report is a necessary component, and I think it'll pay value given that we will get a report coming out of Southern Health Partnership or the government as to why they're choosing their site, and it will be either an agreement or a counterpoint to whatever they come up with. So in that point, it has value. To Councillor Wiley's point about discussing with government as opposed to telling government what to do, I would have to agree at one point. I do feel sometimes Councillor Benson Pope uses a rhetoric that I perhaps wouldn't go to in terms of the extent to which we need to put ourselves as juxtapositions to our government, and we would hope our government is thinking in our best interests. But the Southern Health Partnership does not have a place in its meetings for the city, and therefore the chances to talk to government and be involved with the discussions is not an option for us. If that was an option for us, then this behaviour would be outrageous. But it isn't an option, and therefore we have very little option left. I think we are really occupying the space of civil disobedience here. We're simply saying we don't want to be told without discussion what's going to happen, and therefore we want to tell you what we believe. That's all we're really saying here. I believe it's very important when a discussion is going on in a building that you're not inside that building, that it's made clear that you will not be happy if the decision comes out other than the one that you're asked for. And I think that is all we're saying here. And so therefore, I'm definitely supporting Part A, and obviously I think anybody would want the city to do the best it can to get the best we can out of this, so I will be supporting Part B as well.
Well done.
Are there any other speakers? In that case, I might just have a little bit of a speak before I hand over to Councillor Benson Pope for his right of reply. I think we've taken this report and tried to misunderstand what its purpose was. And in being involved in the moving and seconding of the request to have this report, it was clear in my mind that what we were looking at was to try and understand in independent terms what the impact would be if the choice was to move the hospital from the central business district, where it currently resides, to some other site outside the central business district. And that is an ongoing cost. So while there are additional costs identified in the report to use land in the central city, which is more expensive, that cost is a one-off cost. There is a huge amount of infrastructure in the city, both in terms of businesses, transport routes, power, everything else that is there for the purposes of serving a fairly large hospital. It is on the edge of the university campus. Pretty much all of the very good medical schools around the world are associated closely to a university campus. So the aim of this report was to get an independent view of whether what we all know, what we all thought we knew, was in fact correct, and to give some, I guess, independence to that data so that it could be used to either support or to support, if the decision is for the hospital to go out of the CBD, to support the argument to bring it back in. So I fully support the resolutions. I think it would be a disaster for the city and its residents if the hospital was to move outside the CBD. We've heard Councillor Steadman make comment on the issues of the Wakari site in terms of getting to it in a storm event, particularly snow ice. We don't have those problems. If we have those problems where the current hospital is, then our city is at a standstill. So I think it's a better site all round. I accept that it may be more expensive to do it there, but if it can be achieved, particularly if it can be achieved in collaboration with the university, then I think it will be very good for our city, good for its residents, and good for our economy. Councillor Benson Pope, your right of reply.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just on that last point you've made, it's recognised internationally, as I understand it, that the gold standard for a hospital is a teaching hospital in the central city adjacent to a campus. We've got one of those. And I think we'd be not only stupid, but irresponsible, to put it mildly, if we didn't fight to continue that position. Parking is a problem. It's not a problem for people who don't drive, and all those 65, 75 and 85-year-old plus people, a lot of them won't be driving, by the way, and we do have a bus hub being developed close to the current central city site, among other things, for that reason. But just to make one other comment about parking, I don't think anyone disagrees. Parking is an issue around the current hospital. That's an issue that the DHB would do well to address in terms of better parking arrangements for its own staff, especially the night shift staff. They have the capacity to do that because we own a car park half a block away that they could easily lease a couple of floors of for their night shift people to keep them safe. I'll leave that with them. But we all know that one of the reasons for the discussion with ACC was to try and facilitate more parking above and beyond whatever they might have needed for whatever they were going to or may develop on that site, for the very reason that it would be available for the hospital. So parking is not lost, and parking is an issue that's also raised with us on a regular basis wherever we might be down the street, not with our clipboards but with modern technology, Councillor, because we acknowledge that parking is an issue, and whatever we are doing with reconfiguring the streets with cycleways and whatever else, that has to be attended to by this authority, and I think that's a given. I think this is about action though, and it is, I guess to a degree, as Councillor O'Malley opined, about civil disobedience, although we're not being particularly disobedient, and I'll come back to the process issue in a moment. But it's extraordinary how much effort, what little there is from some of the individuals around this table, goes into actually trying to stop anything happening. With all these mealy-mouthed comments about everyone wants a new hospital, but we're not going to do anything about it, by the way, I just wonder if some people should actually have a look at the oath of office they took when they came to this table and see what the implications of that might be. I think it's important to talk about what's in the newspaper, and I thank Councillor Wiley for waving the ODT around, because one of the most important stories on the front page was yet another horror story about delay. Now, some months ago, we read about ophthalmology failures that led to people losing sight. Is that acceptable? No. Is it acceptable that there are patients in the ward block at Dunedin Hospital now with 2 broken limbs who can't feed themselves and aren't being fed? No, that's not acceptable. Is it acceptable that people are missing out on bypass surgery because there's not enough theatres operating, or because a waiting list has been bumped because of a car accident? No, that's not acceptable. But I'm not going to go on about the horror stories, because we hear them every day out on the street. For me, that's an issue about the general election, and people can play the politics there. But I have no doubt, apart from the conviction that people have shown us on the street about what they think about the hospital location, I have no doubt that one of the greatest issues facing this community is the gross underfunding of the health system, not just in Dunedin, but across the whole country. I want to talk about process now, though, because the suggestion that we should engage with government is very endearing and alluring, isn't it? And Councillor O'Malley has made the point, and he's completely correct. We wanted to engage. We were never invited to be part of the so-called Southern Partnership, almost all but one member resident in the North Island, by the way. We asked for the capacity to participate with that group. The Minister, the local list government member, at one point undertook to facilitate a discussion to that end, but rapidly forgot about it. And it's worthwhile saying that his performance, indeed, in respect of the ACC discussions, has been less than lustrous. In process, in terms of governments respond to what the community requires, demands and wants, no more than in an election year. And I have to bore you again with the example of the courthouse. No one in this room can be under any illusion that if this council had not mounted a campaign about the restoration and strengthening and refurbishment of the Category 1 historic New Zealand High Court, it would be sitting empty now. And if you think that political action doesn't work, go down Stewart Street, anyone, and have a look. And it's like a monument to the effectiveness. That green tape around the scaffolding is like, to me, a monument to the effectiveness of political action. Because even in those Treasury papers when they were released, Treasury acknowledged that there was a strong public feeling that would be very resistant to the abandonment of that building. Now, all our engineers said 5 million would be enough. That's fine. The government, as a result of that campaign, is committed just on 20, and the courts will be moving back to that Category 1 heritage building by the end of next year. Well, that's a victory that came about because of this Dunedin community saying what it wouldn't put up with. And this Dunedin community saying to Treasury, you are not going to abandon that building, Justice Department. And even though Treasury said, well, don't refurbish it, Cabinet, but if you're going to refurbish it, knock the tower down because that'll make it cheaper. Now that's the sort of risk we run with the decisions and advice that will come from Treasury about the hospital. By definition, Treasury will most likely go for the cheapest option. Is building downtown and the best place for us the cheapest option? No, it's not. There will be lots of cheaper options, but it's the best option. And it's the only one that's acceptable for this community. And it's our responsibility to do something about that, not say, oh, we shouldn't do anything about it. We'll leave it to the good officers of government to do that. And should by some unlikely event there be a change of government, I'll be saying, if we haven't got a commitment to this request, demand, necessity from this authority, I'll be saying just as loudly, if not more loudly, to a different government that Dunedin people will take no less than a top-flight teaching hospital in or near the present location.
All right, I'll put it. I've had a request to put the two resolutions separately, and I have a request for division. So we will put A by division.
Sorry, I'll call these. We've just got a short call, so Lynn will record them. Councillor Benson Pope. Councillor Elder. Councillor Gary.
Aye.
Councillor Hall. Councillor Hawkins. Councillor Laufiso. Councillor Lord. Councillor Newell.
Aye.
Councillor O'Malley. Councillor Steedman. Councillor Vandevers.
No.
Councillor Wiley.
No.
Councillor Wilson. Aye. Councillor Staines.
Aye.
Carried 12-2.
Now we will do B. Will be by division too.
Councillor Benson Pope. Councillor Elder. Councillor Gary.
Aye.
Councillor Hall. Councillor Hawkins. Councillor Laufiso. Councillor Lord. Councillor Newell.
Aye.
Councillor O'Malley.
Aye.
Councillor Steedman. Councillor Vandevers.
No.
Councillor Wiley. Yes. Councillor Wilson. Aye. Councillor Staines.
Aye.
Carried 13-1.
Okay, we move on to item 15, review of the alcohol ban area. Wish to speak to the item or? No? Okay. Questions, councillors? Councillor Gary.
Mr Meacham, can you just explain the 5-year review period and why that's preferable to possibly a shorter period in terms of reviewing the extension, or the need for an extension?
It was really just a number pulled out of the hat, a nice round number, but it also gives time for any cultural change to become more apparent. If it's much shorter than that, it may not be as obvious.
And of course, it does say sooner if the need arises. So if things aren't stable, we can bring them forward.
Councillor Wilson.
Generally happy to move this if that assists, but I'm just wondering why in the resolution the words of the need for an extension in 5 years as opposed to just a review, because that predicts somewhat that it's going to only look at extending rather than a general review, which I think the Act possibly requires us to do. And so I'd prefer to do the resolution without the words of the need for an extension.
I think that's wise.
Any other questions? If not, I have Councillor Wilson has moved with that change. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Newell. Right. Yes.
In the report, well, you'll recall my association with and support for the extension that occurred, and particularly in terms of View Street. I've certainly had some anecdotal comment about improvement, and you refer generically to improvement in the report. Can you tell us whether there certainly was some, can you tell us whether that's been sustained throughout a longer period of the academic year, in particular in relation to the activities and the backpackers in View Street? Is things quieter than they were and more manageable?
I understand that from the police, yes.
Okay.
Councillor Elder.
Hi, thanks for the report. I was just wondering, there was a questionnaire or a assessment being done about the behaviour and times and hours. What's happening with that?
The police, they provided some data, but it was very crude and decided not to formally present it. The issue is for an extension of any alcohol restriction or during a review, we've got to justify that extension or the alcohol control bylaw by crime data. In the inner city, that's relatively simple, but for the other areas, mainly North Dunedin, the police data only refers to calls for service, so you might get one call, but there's no way of quantifying how many police were there or the time resource required. So the data was just quite inadequate for what we needed to progress anything. So they decided not to present it formally.
Thank you.
Councillor Hawkins, if you've got a question or you wish to debate. Questions. So we're still in questions, just so everybody knows.
My apologies. It's just around the wording. So is this, so if this passes, we're asking to ask the same question again in 5 years' time. It's not committing to reviewing it in 5 years' time, where it says consideration be given to a further review. Is that the intention of the recommendation?
Yes, the police and the university are both quite keen for us to just keep readdressing the matter of alcohol in North Dunedin. From memory, I may be corrected, but bylaws have to be reviewed every 10 years, but we're sort of proposing to bring that forward.
To consider it in 5 years' time.
No other questions? In that case, we have a mover, Councillor Wilson, a seconder, Councillor Newell, and we're into debate. Anybody wish to partake in debate? If not, I'll put the resolution. All those in favour?
Aye.
Aye. Against? Carried. Move on. To the submissions to inquiry into the 2016 local authority elections. Welcome, Christy. Welcome, Sandy. To speak to it. Councillor Hawkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple of questions around paragraphs 11 and 12 in the submission around the quote-unquote photo bombing, and where it says it's also requested that there's a discretion over the new practice of photo bombing. It doesn't talk about what we want to happen or discretion to do what, so I'm just interested as to what the intention of that paragraph is.
That could be clarified further, but under the current Local Electoral Act, the council can deal with complaints about advertising, and so if an organisation or a person complained about electoral advertising, the council will resolve that complaint. At this point in time, what is defined as advertising is very restricted, and it doesn't deal with the situation of photobombing or Facebook use or electronic media. It's defined very narrowly. So the discretion or the advice in this paragraph is simply saying that the council should have a discretion on resolving those complaints. At the moment, we can't because they're not part of that legislative system. And so we get unhappy people on both sides of that dispute.
Okay. By way of illustrating your point, for anybody who was paying attention during the last local body campaign, it's not much of a redaction in terms of identifying the candidate who I'm assuming the drafter is suggesting has crossed some kind of line. So is it necessary to include that illustration?
I think for the purpose of explaining what photobombing is, it is a helpful example. It is of course council's submission, and so if you didn't wish to include the image, then we would simply remove it.
And just further on that, it's unclear to me which component of this we're unhappy about. I mean, saying that people shouldn't take their campaign photos in front of the office that they are standing for does seem a bit odd. Is it the Gothic typeface that we're concerned about?
Yes, it is the Gothic typeface, and we had several complaints about the use of it during the course of that campaign.
That would be helpful to explain what it is about the illustration that concerns us, and that in terms of trademarks or whatever. But because it certainly would be difficult to rule out people taking photos of the town hall in their campaign advertising.
So I'll develop the final sentence of that submission where I've explained what the examples are, but reference that use of the Gothic Dunedin. Yep.
Thank you, that's helpful. And I'm happy to incorporate that into a list of amendments that I've proposed and circulated to councillors previously to the amendments to the submission, additions and amendments.
Councillor Benson-Pope.
Thank you. It's a continuation of that discussion about the typeface. So there may be some protection of some kind, trademark or whatever, on the Dunedin, but it's hard to imagine that the font itself could not be used by someone. I'm just saying that this is actually quite problematic. If candidate X were to write their electoral message in that font and not use the Gothic Dunedin, then surely there would be a clear association, but there would be no constraint possible, would there?
It's the Dunedin logo itself that is the concern, because it's meant to be non-political, and the council, it's a citywide brand, not just a council brand, so that was where the concern was.
Other questions? In that case, Councillor Hawkins, you had some suggested changes.
Sorry, I've got a question, Chair.
Go ahead.
Not sure if I can be heard.
Yep.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
Question regarding paragraph 9, where it says, involved in the administration of the deposit are disproportional to its value. What does the writer or what do staff consider to be the value of the deposit in paragraph 9?
So I just need to check that I've understood your question. The deposit is $200, and the point that is being made in paras 8 and 9, admittedly there is a typo there where the paragraph's been split incorrectly, but the issue is that the administration of that $200, the cost of us dealing with that money exceeds $200, and the point we're making there is it's more of there's a benefit and burden that's out of whack.
Do you accept that there is an additional benefit in having a deposit, and that is to prevent people from spuriously applying for a candidacy because there is no financial stake in doing so?
I can't comment about the spurious nature or otherwise, but there are very few cases where people don't get enough votes under the current system to get their deposit refunded. That was all I would say. So.
Right, but my question is, given whether they get their deposit refunded or not, is there not a value in actually having somebody front up with a couple of $100 as some kind of indication of their seriousness as a candidate?
The point of that paragraph is that it costs us more to process the $200, so it's about councillors considering whether they think that that's something they want to submit on.
Right. I don't believe that paragraph 9 is one we should submit on. Because I believe that there is value in having a deposit. I have another question regarding paragraph 13, and that is the claim that we should support online voting. I have done quite a bit of research into the online voting issues, and the insecurity of online voting remains an issue, both here and overseas and other places where it has taken place. What is your view on the level of security that can be provided currently with online voting, and is that level of security such that you believe it is as good as any other type of voting we currently have?
Councillor, I would say that I'm not able to comment on the issues that you raise, but perhaps that's a valid point to be making within the submission itself. And so if we adjusted paragraphs 13 onwards to record concerns about security, then that might be a way forward.
And my last question is that this attachment is signed by the Mayor. I'm wondering, have staff had an input? And if so, which staff, and have they signed it off?
So I have drafted the submission. And I've run that past our electoral officer and deputy electoral officer. Also, the availability of the opportunity to make a submission was circulated to all councillors, and I've received no feedback from elected members at that time, other than the comment that there was an issue around STV or FPP voting, which is a matter that's considered by council later on in the triennium.
I understand that. My question then really is, why does this report not quote the staff members responsible for it?
Because it gets approved by the council, it's a submission from the elected council. It's not a submission from staff.
But also the covering report, if I may, the covering report...
Staff input, I've just been told, and is not solely written by the only undersigned, which is the Mayor.
No, but we're your staff, so we always prepare these submissions and they always go from the Mayor on behalf of the elected council.
And the covering report is written by Christie and signed off by me, and I am the Deputy Electoral Officer. The Electoral Officer is unwell and wasn't able to sign it.
Okay. Yeah, just in future, it would be lovely to have in our paperwork those staff members responsible as well. But thank you.
Councillor O'Malley.
Thanks. I just, do I have to stand first? I've been sitting so long. Back to point 8 and point 9, though, in terms of the deposits and whether or not they keep a frivolous person candidate at bay. I mean, I think if we do take them away, we do need to make sure that we check that in fact, the removal of the deposit doesn't have a negative effect that we didn't anticipate. So will we be checking that, I guess, is the question.
Well, this will be for the entire country, so, and it's difficult to know unless we go and ask people, you look frivolous, would you have still run if you had to pay $200? I mean, one of the other options is that you recommend increasing that amount so it actually is worth the cost of processing, but it's difficult to know.
It doesn't necessarily need to be all that formal. I mean, just basically keeping in mind that that's what that was in here for, and it wasn't really a cost recovery exercise, so the idea that it cost us more to administer than the deposit is not really, I feel, related to the two, because I think...
so you could move taking that out if you're not happy with it.
I don't need to have it taken out. I just more conscious. Can we be conscious of the fact that if it does happen and we do get it removed across the country, I guess follow up and see if whether or not we end up getting an increase or don't get an increase, because in some respects it's an experiment. But the other part is, will the deposit being removed have any impact on people filing their post-election paperwork properly? Because I think the biggest issue and the most important issue here is the spending filing paperwork that people have to put in at the end, and I would want to make sure that this wouldn't have any impact on that.
There is a different piece of the Act that requires people to file those returns, and there are options available to the electoral officer if they're not returned, and we have had to use them in the past.
Councillor Lord.
Sorry, Councillor O'Malley has probably brought up the point, but if we, like say for example, if the cost of deposit management is greater than the value of the deposits that you get to keep, the problem I see is if you do get frivolous people and say you go from suddenly 40 candidates to 90 candidates, it's the cost of printing all the extra documents and all that sort of stuff, and that would just be something that it may far outweigh what you might try and save. You might outweigh a lot more. I don't know the answer, but I think $200 is not unreasonable in terms of, I don't think it would preclude too many people standing. I wouldn't necessarily say we should raise it, but it has been $200 for quite a while, I think, so.
Well, I do wonder whether we would be better to amend this part of the resolution, because I'm not sure either, to be honest. So, and maybe we say, we would like the committee to note that it costs more to administer the processing of this $200 than it does, and we wonder if it does still function as a disincentive, and we suggest the committee look at it rather than a flat, we think, to take it out. So if no support for that amendment.
Councillor Wilson.
I'm just really, really concerned about the language around the table today, and the thought that someone's standing democratically to a position on council in the arrogance of sitting around this table because we've got there, and calling other people frivolous really, really concerns me. It is about people having a chance to stand and to express their views, whether they think they'll get voted on or not. And I really am surprised that that word has got into the, even been used once, let alone several times, and the import that it has about democracy. The $200, I think, is something for a role and a purpose quite different from stopping frivolous, whatever that might be, and This is about democracy and people, and here we have, in the very start of this engagement, trying to get people engaged in the process, and then while we were saying, actually, but if you can't put up $200, you're frivolous. No, that just doesn't make any sense. So if it well, I just want to make the point, because I don't want to hear anyone else doing this. Is it right that that $200 is there to stop frivolous nominations, or is it there for a purpose to cover costs of some process? And we need to work that out before we can actually do a submission on it.
It's to cover administrative costs. The word frivolous doesn't appear in the Act.
So, well, what costs? Because is it the cost of repaying the $200? Because in essence, you could get $200 being paid by a whole lot of people, and all of those people being elected because it's but you still have an election for various reasons. It doesn't cover any costs. I'm not quite sure what costs it's covering. That isn't clear.
If I can just check, I think if you get a certain number of votes, you get it back.
So
it's not to cover any costs at all, which does lead you to believe that it is there to stop 400 people all lining up and putting their name up as a joke. But I think point well made, but I don't think the intent of it is to cover costs, because we have to give it back.
Well, I think it historically was, but who knows?
Very good. Councillor Laufiso.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just referring to paragraph 15 under creation of Māori wards. First of all, can we use macrons for Māori? And secondly, I also would like to ask if paragraph 15 can be sort of reworded or indicate some awareness of the underrepresentation of Māori, not only in the city but throughout this country.
I understand Councillor Hawkins has some reworded suggestions. Does that cover?
There's an amended paragraph 16.
Right. I wonder if it might be helpful to see the proposed amendments that might allay some of the issues that are being discussed.
I favoured the amendment proposed by the Chief Executive for paragraph 9, if that helps.
Thanks. The relevant sentence probably in the proposed amendment to paragraph 16 is, well, it says, in practice this will only be demanded where the desired result is to reverse the council's decision. In effect, a majority of the population can overrule the will of local authorities which does not achieve effective representation for mana whenua. If that's strongly worded enough to satisfy that concern.
Oh, sorry. So through the chair, does this replace paragraph 15?
15 or 16?
I'm
16.
referring to 15.
16?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, this is this is a suggested amendment to paragraph 16. I wonder at what point we want to go through these, but I'm at the discretion of the chair as to when you want me to speak to them. Or
Well, have we finished with questions? Perhaps one way forward would be just to go through the paragraphs quickly in order, and if there is a desire to modify that paragraph, that we then hear what that modification is and decide whether to include it. So the suggestion that's been made is that we delegate this item to a standing committee to work through and make the changes rather than do those here.
If there are more than one or two.
If there's more than one or two. So who is wanting to make any amendments?
This one? Oh, you've got more than one.
Councillor Vanderbilt
I would like to clarify
delete
that
paragraph
in
9.
response, I mean, two of them aren't amendments. Two of them are just clarifications of what was intended in the draft. There's only one amendment, and it's around the apportionment of costs around online voting. That's the only thing that I'm suggesting that is different to the substance of the draft submission, and a desire to speak to the submission if we get the chance, which isn't included in this. Those are the only substantive amendments I'd want to make.
Does anyone else have an amendment they'd like to make? Councillor Vandervis, I think, would like to make the change suggested around paragraphs 8 and 9.
And also, I would like to drop 13. I don't believe that the online voting is currently viable.
Yeah, I think this is becoming too difficult to do in a meeting today, so we will circulate. We have heard from Society of Local Government Managers who have confirmed the $200 was put in place to stop vexatious candidacy. So, and I think that is what councillors were meaning, actually, to be fair. So, but there is the question from their submission is that it hasn't been very effective, or it isn't. It is a little the anti-democratic aspects then have to be weighed up against the vexatious aspects. So yes, we'll circulate. If we leave this, maybe we hang on a minute.
Sorry, can I ask a question about that process? How does that,
I don't know.
How does that process differ to the one we have followed up until this point, where the draft submission was sent out for elected members' feedback?
Nobody gave any.
Nobody gave any. It comes to the meeting, and now all of a sudden there is some. So now we're going to send it around again for elected members' feedback, and it's going to come to a committee meeting, and then do we get to make decisions? I mean, how do we stop the same process happening again the next time we go around it?
Maybe if people give feedback when we send it around, and then, because it is difficult to do this by committee, item by item by item. I mean, we can stick with it and do it. It is your call.
Councillor O'Malley.
But it's just that sometimes you have to be in the committee before you get the sense of understanding what is so you can't really give this feedback before we've all met.
So the next, if we were to refer it, it would go to Community and Culture, or
Community and Culture.
Community and Culture would be the meeting that it would come to. So we would have an opportunity to give everybody a chance to put their suggested wording in an email and circulate it around everyone. So hopefully it's what comes to that standing committee is more clear. So do we need a resolution to that effect? So I'll move that this item be referred to the Community and Culture Committee. With the power to decide, yes.
So meanwhile, we'll make changes that are just issues of clarification, and issues where it appears some councillors want to have the online voting and some don't. We'll put paragraph 13A, 13 option 1, paragraph 13 option 2, so that you can make that decision relatively more succinctly than this.
Okay, I have it seconded by Councillor Benson-Pope. I intend to put it. All in favour? Aye. Against?
Aye.
Carried. We move on. Try and get back to my place. So welcome, Mr. Christie.
Normally you wouldn't have to sit.
Councillor Benson. I've just had it explained to me that there could be considered to be a conflict of interest for those of us who are going to be on or are proposed to be members of the Hearings Committee, and so I'm going to hand the chair to Councillor Benson-Pope. You're in the chair. Do you want to come and occupy the chair?
I now understand. I now understand the possible issue. And so, is there any discussion about the recommendation or questions of staff? No questions? You're withdrawing? Councillor O'Malley.
Thanks, John. To John. The destination plan is to take an integrated approach to destination marketing that includes tourism, education, business and immigration status. And it's to replace the visitor strategy. It looks very much like it's still a tourism plan and doesn't seem to have the rest of the components in it very much. Can you comment on that?
Yes, certainly. One of the omissions in this document was in clause 9, where we talk about feedback and further engagement with the tourism sector. We actually would like to have that engagement representative across all sectors, and we would propose that we would do that as an amendment to this paper. But it certainly is to be inclusive across all sectors of our community.
How do you plan to engage these communities that evidently didn't engage at the end of last year and the beginning of this year by having this hearing? Do you think you can get a fair outcome?
We've had 51 formal submissions, which are a range of submitters across all sectors of our community. There have been a few that missed the deadline that we would like to capture in the hearings process. So for us, this is about getting the very best possible feedback we can to be able to bring back a final destination plan to council. To do that, we need to further engage with some of those stakeholders within our community. So we'd be looking at the hearings process as part of that process.
So consultation. One of the things is we've missed the 13th of March EDC meeting deadline, and then this went to the 28th of March council meeting, and then the public consultation was extended from June 30th to July 7th. And now you've got your submitters in, and now we're going on to additional hearings, which will put more time on this again. To when, I feel that some people in the visitor industry especially are asking the question, when are they going to get to see the actual plan? And to some extent, why is the plan not being written now after these submissions have come in? Because this isn't a strategy, it's a plan, so it would be seen to be more of a operational rather than a governance issue.
The feedback we're getting from the visitor sector in particular is that they want further engagement, which is why we're proposing this process. They will be part of the development of the plan in terms of the final draft, which we would expect will come back to council before December this year.
One last quick question that sort of relates to that, and that is, given that the summer season is not very far off, will this be in time for the summer season?
Look, I have to be honest and say that it will depend on our further engagement with those stakeholders and the length of time it takes for them to agree that we have got a good plan that the whole city can get behind.
Councillor Hawkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is just around the composition of the hearings panel, and I understand that this work sits under the economic development strategy, but you know, where possible, we're trying to take a broader strategic view of all of our planning and strategic work. So, can you talk about whether any consideration was given? And you know, this is by no means a criticism of the chair and two deputy chairs of the Economic Development Committee, but was any consideration given to having a wider strategic remit in hearing public submissions on this work?
Look, we have added in there that there is an ability to delegate additional members there if required through the clause D in point B, and I guess the wider consideration could have been given, but we looked at the Economic Development Committee as being those closest to this topic and able to make informed decisions on the content that should be included in the final plan, as well as a hearing from submitters.
So, and I'm supportive of that DC, as it appears in here, but where it says if required, what do you envisage as being the trigger for that requirement?
I guess skill set and any gaps that we believe there may be required to enable us to get the draft plan to a stage where the community has acceptance of that and can buy into where we're setting the plan in terms of the future direction of marketing the city.
Which sounds more like you don't know who that person might be than you don't see there being one.
No, we do have some names in mind, but we haven't approached them and we haven't got a mandate to do that until council approves this resolution.
Would you be comfortable if that were amended to delete if required from the resolution?
Absolutely.
Thanks.
In terms of the submissions, can you just confirm that if the hearings proceed, that you will entertain oral presentations from those who haven't made a written submission? Because I know Te Aotearoa partnership members are very keen to comment on the draft.
Procedurally, that might some issues. It might be smoother if we accept a late written submission and then they can speak to their submission.
That's fine. I'll make sure they know that. That's all. Yeah, thank you. Any further questions? Councillor Elder.
I was just wanting to clarify some of the thing. It's my understanding then that this means it opens it up for people to actually put in more submissions should they want to. Is that what you're saying?
I think that's the indication. If they do provide written submissions before the hearings date, they will be able to be included in the decision-making process, yes.
Thank you. I think that's a great thing.
All right, we'll go to the recommendations then. Do I have a mover, please? They're on page something or other. 133. Move Councillor Hawkins, seconded. Newell, Councillor Newell, had a block. Apologies. I'll make it up to you. Any discussion? Councillor Hawkins.
Yeah, I just want to speak to it briefly, and I should make it clear that I'm moving it with that amendment, deleting the words if required from BDC. Per the order paper. I know it's been a stressful few weeks and I shouldn't be such a pedant. I would like to, I just want to applaud staff actually for taking the step of holding public hearings on our destination plan. There's no doubt in my mind, and there won't be for anybody who's sat on, in particular, resource management or district plan change hearings, the value in hearing from people and having them come and elucidate upon their written submissions, acknowledging that written submissions aren't the strength of everyone. And there is a lot to be gained from people coming and discussing these things. I'm comfortable that the delegated authority to appoint an independent member will give a broader strategic scope to those hearing submissions. So I look forward to that. I just think it's a shame, given that we're going through this process, that it's been denied so much of our strategic development work and plan development work up until this point. Many of our major strategies were developed in consultation with our community, but by written submission only, and we weren't afforded the option for people to come and speak to Te Aotearoa or Te Aratoi, Otapoti, or anything, in fact, along these lines in the time that I've been here, which I think is a shame. In fact, people weren't even allowed to come and speak to our annual plan hearings during this last cycle. So I commend this approach and would remind everybody around this table this afternoon who's supporting the value of holding public hearings on our destination plan, that next time we come to decide on whether or not to have public hearings on our annual plan or any of our other strategic documents, that they would take a similar view. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor, for your subtlety. Now, is there further speakers? Councillor O'Malley.
as a person who does support the consultation of the annual plan, I'm going to support this, but I'm going to give a feedback saying that time is of the essence, and there are people who are stakeholders in this who felt that this plan should already be in action. And that when we had the March council meeting, I raised the point that the current plan that was in front of us to be considered for public consideration lacked key performance indicators and actual action plans. And so it is good that the public is consulted. I would wonder, though, if we should consider whether or not our ability to consult in general terms as we establish policy was it actually, whether this actually was a good outcome, because the fact that we're having to go to a formal public consultation now at this point, in some respects, it must indicate that we don't have enough guidance to go forward to write this plan. Or we do, and therefore we're doing something we don't need to do. It's either going to be one or the other. So my real feedback is, let's do it, because we're going to go ahead and do it. But it's got to get finished, because there are people out there who are saying that they really are waiting on this plan to come out. Thanks.
Thank you. Further speakers? Okay, I'll put it, and I'll put both A and B together unless there's any issue. All right, so we're establishing the committee and appointing the 3 members. Those in favour, please. 3, perhaps one other, if necessary. No, it's deleting if required. 1 independent member if required. Oh, is that gone? Okay, so, all right, so if required has been removed, so it's appointing 4. Those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against, no?
Aye.
That's unanimous. Thank you very much.
All right, we are moving on to item 18, Part Sawyers Bay Recreation Reserve Proposed Drainage Easement.
Happy to move.
Welcome, Jenny. This afternoon.
Happy to move. Great.
We have a mover and a seconder, but are there any questions, or do you have anything you'd like to tell us?
No, we're happy to take any questions.
No questions? So who moved? Councillor Wilson. Seconded, Councillor Benson-Pope. Oh, Councillor Newell, you were in first. Very good. All right. Is there any discussion? If not, I'll put it. All in favour? Aye. Against? Aye. Carried.
More agreeable when he's on the other side of the
Right. What's next? Classification, item 19, classification of Wakawaiti Recreation Reserve.
Similar, happy to take any questions.
Councillor O'Malley.
Does this in any way change how the reserve will be run, specifically around camping, actually?
No. The idea with this is to make it actually simpler. It avoids giving concession documents to the lessees, and we can just give template leases to all the sports clubs. So it's actually simpler.
Moved by Councillor Wilson, seconded by Councillor Hall.
Oh.
Do you have a question, or do you want to enter debate?
I wouldn't rule out the latter. Depends on the response to the former, I suppose. I'm just seeking assurance, really, that any of the considerations that are taken into account through the granting of a dock concession, all of that will still be considered when council decides how that land is used and managed by external organisations.
Really, it's a recreation reserve, so the Reserves Act will take place, and the process is very similar, but the concession is a bit more complicated administratively. So that's, and we will be treating all the lessees the same as we would treat any other lessees on our reserve land.
So this process will allow the reserve to be treated like most of our reserves across the city. So the dock concession process, etc., would still occur in the future.
And just secondly, sorry, my computer's frozen, so I can't access the maps readily, but does this mean, if this proposal goes ahead, that the rodeo will be occurring on council land?
The rodeo is occupied within the recreation reserve, and that is correct.
But it currently isn't council land, but will become council land.
It's currently controlled and managed by council. So we have the authority to control and manage it. Once this classification happens, it means the land is vested in council. So that gives us the authority to administer it the same as we would any other reserve under the Reserves Act, rather than through the Conservation Act.
Questions? If not, I have a mover and a seconder, so we have debate. Okay, I'll put it. All in favour?
Aye.
Against?
Aye.
Carried. Where are we now? Yep, just wait while I get up the paperwork. Where are we? The resolution to, you're happy to move the resolution? I'll move, Councillor Wilson seconds, the resolution to exclude the public. All in favour?
Aye.
Against? Carried.